I'm General Christina Nolan, 40 years old, and I built my career in the force through 15 years of service and sacrifice. For years, I carried the weight in my family, supporting, covering, making sure things held together. But when my own parents raised a glass at my sister's engagement party and toasted her as their only successful child, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, humiliated, or undervalued by the very people you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. The champagne flute trembled slightly in my hand as I watched my parents move through the crowd at my sister's engagement party. The country club's ballroom buzzed with conversation, designer dresses rustling against polished marble floors, and the soft clink of crystal glasses. Everything about the evening screamed perfection, from the white orchid centerpieces to the string quartet in the corner, and I should have felt proud to be part of it. Instead, I felt like an observer watching a play I'd never been cast in. "Angelina looks radiant," someone said behind me, and I turned to see Mrs. Jones from down the street, her eyes fixed on my sister as she floated between guests in her cream silk dress. "Your parents must be so thrilled." I nodded and took a sip of champagne, the bubbles sharp against my tongue. My sister did look radiant. She always had. Even as children, she possessed this effortless magnetism that drew people in, while I was the one who cleaned up the messes she left behind, the one who made sure homework got done and chores were finished. Tonight was no different. She was the star, and I was background scenery. The past 6 months had been building to this moment. Ever since she announced her engagement to Max, our parents had transformed into event coordinators, party planners, and social directors all rolled into one. Every conversation at family dinners revolved around wedding venues, guest lists, and flower arrangements. When I tried to share news about my recent promotion, Mom had cut me off mid-sentence to discuss catering options. When I mentioned the commendation I'd received from my commanding officer, Dad had nodded absently before launching into a discussion about the wine selection. "Your sister always knew how to make us proud," Mom had said just last week, not realizing I was standing in the doorway. She was on the phone with her sister, voice carrying that particular tone of maternal satisfaction. "She's marrying into such a wonderful family. The Ashfords have connections everywhere. Max's father owns half the commercial real estate downtown." I'd backed away quietly, the words settling like stones in my chest. 15 years in the military, deployments in 3 different countries, citations for leadership under fire, none of it seemed to register as success in their eyes. My career was dangerous and lacked real stability. My sister's engagement to a wealthy man's son, however, represented everything they valued. At family dinners, the pattern had become predictable. I'd start to share something about my work, and one of them would interrupt with a question about wedding planning or redirect the conversation to Max's achievements. He was successful, they'd say. He had a future. He came from good people with old money and newer connections. The subtle digs had started months ago, but they'd grown sharper as the engagement party approached. "I just want you to be happy," Mom would say, her tone suggesting my current life fell short of that goal. "Your sister found someone who can take care of her. Security matters more than adventure." Dad was less direct, but equally clear. He'd stopped asking about my deployments and started talking about settling down and thinking about the future. When colleagues called the house looking for me, he'd take messages with polite disinterest, as if my professional life was a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. Tonight, watching my parents work the room, I could see how thoroughly they'd embraced their role as parents of the golden child. They moved with practiced pride, accepting congratulations as if they'd personally orchestrated their daughter's happiness. Mom wore a navy dress I'd never seen before, obviously purchased for the occasion, and Dad had gotten his hair cut at an expensive salon downtown. They looked like the parents they'd always wanted to be. "General Morrison sends his regards," I'd told them last month when my commanding officer had asked me to pass along his compliments about their daughter's service record. They'd smiled politely and changed the subject to flower arrangements. I moved toward the bar, needing something stronger than champagne. The bartender, a young man with careful hands and professional discretion, poured me a whiskey without being asked. He'd probably been watching faces all evening, reading the subtle signs of family tension that expensive parties couldn't quite mask. Family events, he said quietly, sliding the glass across the polished wood. They bring out interesting dynamics. I almost smiled. That's one way to put it. The crowd shifted around us, conversations flowing like water around rocks. I caught fragments of praise for my sister, her dress, her ring, her choice in men. Max was handsome, successful, well-connected. His family owned property in 3 states and a house in Martha's Vineyard. He'd graduated from Harvard Business School and worked at his father's firm. On paper, he was everything parents dreamed of for their daughters. What struck me wasn't their admiration for Max. He seemed like a decent enough man, but the way it highlighted everything my own life wasn't. I'd never brought home someone wealthy or connected. I'd never worn a ring that sparked conversations across crowded rooms. I'd never been the center of this kind of celebration. "She's the one who really made it," I heard someone say, and I turned to see a cluster of my parents' friends near the windows. They were looking at my sister with the kind of approval that comes from external validation, the social success that dinner parties and country clubs recognize. I'd learned not to argue with these assessments. Years of military training had taught me to pick my battles, and family gatherings weren't worth the ammunition. But standing there in my simple black dress, appropriate but unremarkable, I felt the weight of their judgment settling around me like smoke. The string quartet shifted to a waltz, and couples moved onto the small dance floor. Max led my sister into the center, his hand steady on her waist, her laugh bright enough to carry across the room. They looked like they belonged in a magazine spread about perfect young couples starting perfect lives. My parents watched from the edge of the dance floor, Dad's arm around Mom's shoulders, both of them glowing with satisfaction. This was their triumph as much as hers, proof that they'd raised at least one child who understood how to succeed in ways that mattered to them. The whiskey burned warm in my chest, and I realized I was gripping the glass harder than necessary. The evening was far from over, and something in the air suggested the worst was yet to come. But I'd survived worse than family disappointment, and I'd learned to maintain my composure under pressure. I just hadn't expected the pressure to come from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The moment arrived with deceptive simplicity. My parents had been building to it all evening, working the room, accepting congratulations, basking in reflected glory. When the time came for toasts, they positioned themselves at the front of the room with the confidence of people who'd been waiting for this opportunity their entire lives. Dad tapped his knife against his champagne flute, the crystal chime cutting through conversation like a blade. The room gradually quieted, faces turning toward him with polite expectation. He cleared his throat, smiled broadly, and raised his glass high. "Friends, family, thank you all for celebrating this wonderful occasion with us tonight," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Margaret and I couldn't be prouder of our daughter Angelina and her choice in Max." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. I stood near the back, my own glass raised dutifully, watching my parents claim the spotlight they'd been seeking all evening. Mom beamed beside Dad, her hand resting on his arm in practiced solidarity. "Angelina has always been special," Mom continued, taking the microphone Dad offered her. "From the time she was small, we knew she had that spark, that ability to light up a room and make everyone around her better. She's accomplished everything she's set her mind to, and now she's found a partner who matches her in every way." The praise flowed like honey, sweet and thick and designed to stick. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life at birthday parties, graduations, family gatherings. My sister was the natural star, the one who made friends easily, who excelled without trying, who instinctively understood the social rules that had always mystified me. "Max," Dad said, raising his glass toward my sister's fiancé, "welcome to the family. You're getting a treasure, and we couldn't be happier to call you son." More applause, more smiles. Max looked appropriately humble and grateful, his arm around my sister's waist, both of them glowing under the attention. This was their moment, their celebration, their future being blessed by everyone who mattered. Then Dad's expression shifted slightly, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes finding mine for just a moment before moving on. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. "It means everything to us," he said slowly, "to finally have something to really celebrate. To toast our only successful child." The words hit the room like a physical force. Laughter erupted immediately, not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes from surprise and recognition. Guests nodded appreciatively, as if my parents had finally said what everyone had been thinking. Crystal glasses lifted in unified salute to my sister, who beamed with the kind of radiant joy that comes from having every dream validated publicly. I stood frozen, the champagne flute suddenly heavy in my hand. The laughter continued around me, rolling through the crowd like a wave, and I heard it as a verdict being read aloud. 15 years of military service, deployments in hostile territory, commendations for leadership under fire, none of it registered as success in their accounting. My sister leaned toward me, her eyes bright with triumph. The proximity was deliberate, calculated for maximum impact. "Guess that settles it," she murmured, her voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. The words were delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from someone who's never doubted their place in the hierarchy. Before I could respond, before I could even process the full weight of what had just happened, movement at the front of the room caught my attention. The groom's father, a man I'd barely spoken to all evening, was rising from his seat at the head table. Colonel James Ashford was in his 70s, silver-haired and straight-backed, with the kind of bearing that comes from decades of command authority. He stood slowly, deliberately, his chair scraping against the floor in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the room. Every eye turned toward him, including mine. For a moment, he simply looked at me across the crowded space, his gaze steady and assessing. Then he smiled, not the social smile he'd worn all evening, but something different, something that spoke of recognition and respect. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "Before we continue, I need to say something." The room fell completely silent. My parents looked puzzled, uncertain whether this was planned or improvised. My sister's smile faltered slightly, confusion replacing triumph in her expression. Colonel Ashford turned to face me directly, his posture shifting into something I recognized immediately, the formal bearing of one military officer acknowledging another. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "It's an honor to meet General Nolan." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Then, with movements precise as a drill manual, he brought his right hand up in a crisp military salute. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Conversations died mid-word. Champagne flutes stopped halfway to lips. The comfortable laughter that had greeted my parents' toast evaporated like morning fog. Every face in the room turned toward me, expressions shifting from casual interest to stunned recognition. My parents stood frozen at the front of the room, the microphone still in Mom's hand, their faces cycling through confusion, shock, and something that might have been fear. Dad's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. My sister's jaw literally dropped. The confident smirk she'd worn moments before crumbled into bewilderment. Her eyes darted between Colonel Ashford and me, as if trying to solve an equation that didn't make sense. Around the room, whispers began, urgent, embarrassed conversations as guests recalibrated their understanding of the evening. I caught fragments. "Did you know? Why didn't they say? A general?" The social calculus that had seemed so clear moments before was suddenly turned upside down. Colonel Ashford held his salute until I nodded acknowledgement, then lowered his hand with the same precision he'd raised it. The respect in his gesture was unmistakable, and it stood in stark contrast to everything that had come before. The silence stretched on, heavy with implication. My parents' toast, their celebration of their only successful child, hung in the air like smoke, its cruelty now visible to everyone present. What had seemed like harmless family teasing moments before was revealed as something much darker. I remained standing where I was, my champagne flute still raised, my expression carefully neutral. Years of military training had taught me to maintain composure under fire, and this moment called for every lesson I'd learned about grace under pressure. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The betrayal of that toast would linger long after the applause faded, deeper than any wound I'd received in combat. Even with the room's attention now on me, even with Colonel Ashford's respect bridging the gap my parents had tried to create, their words had landed exactly where they'd intended. They'd made their choice clear. Now I would make mine. Growing up, I was the dependable one. While Angelina threw tantrums that somehow became charming stories at dinner parties, I was the child who cleaned up messes, finished chores without being asked, and made sure homework got done on time. Our parents never called it that, but the roles were clear from the beginning. She was the star, and I was the stage crew. Angelina could forget to feed our dog for a week, and I'd quietly refill the water bowl and measure out kibble without mentioning it. She'd promise to help Mom with dishes and then disappear upstairs to talk on the phone, leaving me to finish the job while listening to our parents laugh about her social butterfly nature. When she borrowed my clothes without asking and returned them stained or torn, I'd wash them myself rather than start another argument. "You're so responsible," Mom would say, as if responsibility were a consolation prize for not being naturally gifted. "Your sister has that spark, but you keep everything running smoothly." The pattern extended beyond household chores. In school, I tutored Angelina through algebra and helped her write history reports she'd put off until the last minute. When she failed her driving test twice, I spent hours in empty parking lots with her, teaching her parallel parking and three-point turns. When she finally passed on the third attempt, our parents celebrated with dinner at her favorite restaurant. When I passed on the first try, they nodded approvingly and asked if I could drive Angelina to school the next week. College applications revealed the divide most clearly. I'd researched schools methodically, written essays months in advance, and applied for scholarships with military precision. Angelina waited until the last minute, then charmed her way through interviews and relied on Dad's connections to secure her spot at his alma mater. Both approaches worked, but only one was celebrated as cleverness and social intelligence. When I announced my decision to join the military after graduation, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Mom's face fell as if I'd announced a terminal illness. Dad launched into a lecture about throwing away opportunities and limiting my future options. Angelina, home for spring break, looked at me with genuine bewilderment. "Why would you want to do that?" she asked. "You could get a real job. You could stay here." The assumption that my choice was somehow inferior, that serving my country was a step down from whatever they'd imagined for me, stung more than I'd expected. But I'd already learned not to seek their approval for decisions that mattered to me. The military represented everything I valued: clear standards, earned respect, and advancement based on merit rather than connections. Boot camp was brutal, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, my efforts were measured against objective standards. Physical fitness, marksmanship, leadership under pressure — these things could be quantified, improved, and recognized without regard for charm or social connections. When I excelled, it was acknowledged. When I struggled, I was given clear direction for improvement. My first deployment came 2 years later. I wrote home faithfully, sending letters that described the landscape, the people I worked with, and the sense of purpose that came from meaningful work. I sent photographs of ancient ruins and modern cities, hoping to share something of what I was experiencing. The responses were polite but brief: Mom asking if I was eating enough, Dad wondering when I'd be coming home for good. Meanwhile, Angelina had graduated and was working at a marketing firm downtown, a position she'd secured through a family friend. Her social life was busy and well documented through photos she shared regularly: parties, weekend trips, dinners at trendy restaurants. Our parents spoke about her activities with genuine enthusiasm, proud of her social success and professional connections. When I made sergeant ahead of schedule, I called home expecting some recognition of the achievement. Instead, the conversation quickly shifted to Angelina's promotion to account coordinator and her new apartment in the fashionable part of town. My advancement was military bureaucracy. Hers was real progress in the real world. The pattern continued through subsequent deployments and promotions. I'd send money home for birthdays and holidays, arrange video calls despite time zone differences, and share what victories I could without violating operational security. But the emotional investment was increasingly one-sided. Family conversations revolved around Angelina's dating life, her career moves, her social circle. My achievements were acknowledged briefly before discussion returned to more interesting topics. The imbalance had always been there, but distance and time made it impossible to ignore. Angelina leveraged her natural charm and family connections to advance quickly in her field. She dated men from prominent families, attended the right social events, and built the kind of network that opened doors without effort. Where I invested years in developing genuine expertise and leadership skills, she was celebrated for being naturally gifted at the things our parents valued most. During my third deployment, I received a commendation for leadership during a particularly difficult mission. The citation recognized not just my tactical decisions, but my ability to maintain unit cohesion under extreme stress. It was the kind of recognition that came from peers who understood the stakes, who'd seen leadership tested under the worst possible conditions. When I called home to share the news, Mom's first question was whether I'd be home for Angelina's housewarming party. The commendation was wonderful, dear, but the party required immediate attention, guest lists, catering, decorations. My achievement was filed away politely while Angelina's social event took center stage. Looking back, I realized the engagement party hadn't created our family dynamic, it had simply revealed what had always been true. My parents had chosen their favorite child decades ago, and nothing I accomplished would change that fundamental preference. Military service was something I'd chosen to do, not something that made them proud. My career was an expensive hobby that took me away from what really mattered: family gatherings, social connections, and the kind of conventional success they could brag about to their friends. The clarity was painful but also freeing. I'd spent years seeking approval that was never going to come, trying to translate military achievements into language my parents would understand and value. But their toast at the engagement party had made their position unmistakably clear. I wasn't their successful child, and I never would be. That realization would prove more liberating than devastating, though I didn't know it yet. For the first time in my adult life, I was about to stop measuring myself against their standards and start living according to my own. The ride home from the engagement party was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I drove through empty suburban streets, past houses where families were probably having normal conversations about normal things: homework, weekend plans, tomorrow's weather. The silence in my car felt deafening after the chaos of the evening, but it was a relief compared to facing the aftermath at the party. After Colonel Ashford's salute, the dynamics had shifted immediately and irreversibly. Guests who'd been politely ignoring me all evening suddenly materialized at my elbow, eager to shake my hand and ask questions about my service. The same people who'd laughed at my parents' toast were now recalibrating their understanding of the evening's social hierarchy. "I had no idea," Mrs. Jones had whispered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Your parents never mentioned, we just assumed." She hadn't finished the sentence, but she didn't need to. They'd assumed exactly what my parents had encouraged them to assume, that Angelina was the successful daughter, the one worth celebrating, while I was the family disappointment who'd chosen an unconventional path that led nowhere important. My parents had spent the rest of the evening in damage control mode, their practiced social smiles growing more strained with each conversation. I'd watched them field questions they couldn't answer, deflect congratulations they hadn't expected, and navigate a suddenly complicated social landscape they'd never had to traverse before. Angelina had recovered her composure quickly, as she always did, but something had changed in her expression. The easy confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone, replaced by a wariness I'd never seen before. She'd avoided eye contact with me for the rest of the party, staying close to Max and his family, as if their proximity could restore the natural order that had been disrupted. Now, alone in my car with the party behind me, I replayed Colonel Ashford's words and the moment that had followed. The pride in his voice when he'd called me general, the respect in his posture when he'd saluted, it was everything I'd been seeking from my own family for 15 years. A stranger had given me more recognition in 30 seconds than my parents had managed in a decade and a half of military service. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years trying to translate my achievements into language my family would understand, sending home news of promotions and commendations, hoping to bridge the gap between their world and mine. But it had taken another military family, people who understood what rank meant, what service cost, to provide the acknowledgement I'd been craving. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the darkness for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled. The house I'd bought 3 years ago was modest, but comfortable, furnished with the practical mindset of someone who'd moved frequently and learned not to accumulate unnecessary possessions. It was nothing like Angelina's apartment with its designer furniture and carefully curated social spaces, but it was mine. Inside, I poured myself another whiskey and settled into the leather chair I'd bought after my last promotion. The silence felt different now, not empty, but clean. No undercurrents of tension, no need to monitor conversations for subtle insults or casual dismissals. Just quiet space where I could think without performing. My parents' toast hadn't been a slip of the tongue or a moment of poor judgment. It was the culmination of years of carefully constructed narrative, the public expression of private thoughts they'd been nurturing since I'd first chosen a path they couldn't understand or value. They'd raised their glasses to celebrate their only successful child because that was genuinely how they saw the situation. The cruelty wasn't in the words themselves, but in the deliberate nature of the exclusion. They'd had dozens of opportunities over the years to acknowledge my achievements, to include my career in their definition of success, to show even minimal pride in what I'd accomplished. Instead, they'd chosen to diminish it, to frame my service as something temporary and unimportant, a phase I'd eventually outgrow when I came to my senses. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Mom's number appeared on the caller ID, and I stared at it for several rings before deciding to answer. "Sweetheart," her voice was carefully controlled, "we need to talk about tonight." "Do we?" That was unexpected. Colonel Ashford's announcement. "We had no idea he told the truth, Mom." "That's all he did." A pause, then, "You have to understand, we were just celebrating Angelina's engagement. It wasn't meant to be about anyone else." "You're right," I said quietly. "It wasn't about anyone else. It was specifically about me not mattering." "That's not, you're being dramatic." It was just a turn of phrase. "Everyone knows we're proud of both our daughters." The words hung between us, and I realized this was the moment of choice. I could accept her explanation, pretend the evening had been a misunderstanding, and return to the familiar dance of seeking approval that would never come. Or I could acknowledge what had actually happened and respond accordingly. "No, Mom. Everyone knows you're proud of Angelina. What they learned tonight is that you've been ashamed of me for 15 years. That's not true. You've never asked about my work except to wonder when I'd quit. You've never mentioned my rank to your friends. You've never celebrated a promotion or acknowledged a commendation. Tonight you announced to a room full of people that I'm not successful, that Angelina is your only child worth celebrating." That wasn't a slip, that was the truth. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice smaller than before. "We just wanted tonight to be about Angelina." It was about Angelina. But it was also about making sure everyone understood that she's the only daughter you consider worth having. When she didn't respond, I continued, "The problem isn't that you celebrated her. The problem is that you used me as contrast to make her shine brighter. You didn't just praise her, you erased me." "You're overreacting, am I?" When Colonel Ashford saluted me tonight, half the room looked genuinely surprised to learn about my rank. "Your own friends didn't know I'm a general because you've spent years not telling them." "That's a choice you made, Mom. Every time you had a chance to mention my career and chose not to, every time you changed the subject when I tried to share something important, that was you deciding I wasn't worth celebrating." The conversation ended quietly, without resolution or apology. After I hung up, I sat in my chair until the whiskey was gone and the house around me settled into deeper quiet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, family phone calls, attempts at reconciliation, pressure to pretend nothing had changed. But something had changed, irrevocably and completely. My parents' toast had stripped away years of carefully maintained illusions, and Colonel Ashford's salute had shown me what respect looked like when it was genuine. For the first time in my adult life, I had perfect clarity about where I stood with my family and what that meant for the future. They'd made their choice. Now it was time to make mine. The decision crystallized slowly, like ice forming on a window. I'd spent the night after the engagement party replaying every conversation, every slight, every moment over the years when I'd swallowed my disappointment and tried harder to earn recognition that was never going to come. By morning, the path forward was clear. I wouldn't be chasing their validation anymore. No more explaining my choices, no more translating military achievements into civilian language, no more hoping the next promotion or commendation would finally make them proud. I was done performing for an audience that had already decided I wasn't worth applauding. The first test came sooner than expected. 3 days after the party, Mom called during my morning coffee, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal authority she'd used throughout my childhood. "We're having Sunday dinner this weekend," she announced, as if the engagement party had never happened. "Your father's making his famous pot roast, and Angelina wants to show everyone her engagement photos. Can you be here by 2? I'd attended 1,000 Sunday dinners, dutiful in my role as the reliable daughter who showed up on time and helped clear the table afterward. The invitation carried the implicit assumption that whatever had happened at the party, normal family operations would resume without discussion. "I won't be there," I said simply. A pause. "What do you mean you won't be there? You're always here for Sunday dinner." "Not anymore. Don't be ridiculous. We're family. This is what families do." The word ridiculous hit like a familiar slap. How many times had they used it to dismiss my feelings, my perspectives, my attempts to be heard? I'd been ridiculous for choosing military service, ridiculous for taking deployments seriously, ridiculous for wanting acknowledgement of my achievements. Now I was being ridiculous for having feelings about their public humiliation. "You made your feelings about family very clear at the engagement party," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm simply responding accordingly. You're taking this way too personally. It was just a joke, honey." Everyone understood that. Everyone understood that you consider Angelina your only successful child. You said it publicly, and you meant it. I'm not angry about that. I'm just done pretending it's something different. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the positions were fixed. Mom alternated between minimizing the toast and suggesting I was overreacting, never quite acknowledging what had actually happened, but making it clear she expected me to move past it without further discussion. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. No guilt about missing family dinner, no anxiety about disappointing them, no complicated calculations about how to maintain peace while protecting my dignity. Just clean, simple clarity about boundaries. Sunday came and went without apologies or compromises. Monday brought a text from Angelina that was masterfully crafted to sound concerned while delivering maximum emotional manipulation. "Mom says you're not coming to dinner anymore? This is really unlike you. Everyone's worried. You're making this about you again when it should be about family." I deleted the text without responding. Angelina had perfected the art of positioning herself as the reasonable one while painting me as the problem, and I wasn't interested in playing that game anymore. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted at the engagement party: public recognition as the favored daughter, and now she was annoyed that there were consequences. The invitations continued over the following weeks. Birthday celebrations, family barbecues, casual get-togethers that had once formed the rhythm of our relationship. I declined them all politely but firmly, offering no explanations or justifications. The shift felt seismic but also necessary, like finally setting a broken bone properly after years of working around the pain. My absence created more tension than my presence ever had. Dad called after I missed his birthday dinner, his voice careful and controlled. "Your mother's upset," he said. "She thinks you're punishing us for something that was never meant to hurt you." "I'm not punishing anyone," I replied. "I'm just not available for events where I'm not wanted." "You're always wanted. You're part of this family." The words were right, but they came too late and without the weight of truth behind them. I'd been part of the family in the same way furniture is part of a room, useful when needed, ignored otherwise, valued primarily for function rather than inherent worth. Being wanted and being valued are different things, Dad. Angelina is valued. I'm tolerated. The engagement party made that distinction public, but it didn't create it. He tried to argue, but we both knew he was defending a position that couldn't be sustained by evidence. 15 years of minimized achievements, redirected conversations, and casual dismissals had created a record that spoke for itself. The family dynamics shifted in predictable ways. Angelina's engagement planning hit complications, venue problems, vendor issues, guest list management. In the past, I would have stepped in to help coordinate solutions, making phone calls and managing details while she focused on the glamorous aspects. Now those responsibilities fell to our parents, who quickly discovered that Angelina's organizational skills were more theoretical than practical. Their complaints were subtle but unmistakable. Phone calls that once ended with easy conversation now carried undertones of stress and frustration. Angelina's demands were mentioned more frequently, her expectations described in terms that suggested burden rather than joy. They'd gotten the daughter they'd always celebrated, but they'd lost the one who'd made everything work smoothly behind the scenes. Meanwhile, my own life continued to advance. A new assignment came through with increased responsibilities and a commendation from my commanding officer for the previous year's performance. Colleagues treated me with the respect I'd learned not to expect from family, and my professional relationships were built on competence and mutual regard rather than obligation and disappointment. For the first time in years, I allowed that respect to be enough. I didn't filter professional recognition through the lens of whether my parents would understand or approve. I didn't translate military achievements into civilian terms in hopes of earning acknowledgement that would never come. I simply accepted that I was valued and respected by people who understood what I did and why it mattered. The shift was subtle but profound. Without the constant drain of seeking approval from people who'd already decided not to give it, I had energy for relationships that were reciprocal and genuine. I invested time in friendships with colleagues who shared my values, pursued interests that brought satisfaction rather than external validation, and gradually built a life that didn't require my family's participation to feel complete. 3 months after the engagement party, Mom called with news that Angelina's wedding planning was becoming overwhelming. The venue had double-booked their date, the caterer had increased prices, and the guest list had grown beyond their budget. Underneath her words was an unspoken question. Would I step in to help manage the crisis? "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said calmly. "Angelina's resourceful, and she has Max's family to help coordinate things. It would mean a lot if I've made my choice, Mom. You made yours. We're all living with the consequences now." The conversation ended without resolution, but with perfect understanding. They'd wanted to celebrate their successful daughter without acknowledging their other daughter's worth. I'd chosen to let them experience the full reality of that decision, including the practical implications of no longer having someone to clean up messes or manage complex situations without recognition. It wasn't revenge, it was simply the natural result of treating someone as disposable until you discover they actually served a purpose. The strain began showing in small ways first. Mom's voice carried a new edge of exhaustion during our brief phone conversations, and Dad mentioned Angelina's wedding planning with the careful tone of someone navigating a minefield. 3 months after the engagement party, the comfortable family dynamic they'd maintained for decades was fracturing under the weight of my absence. Angelina's organizational skills, it turned out, were better suited to choosing venues than managing the complex logistics of actually securing them. The venue double booking was just the beginning. The photographer they'd hired was booked for the wrong date, the florist had misunderstood the order, and the catering contract contained clauses no one had bothered to read carefully. Each crisis required someone to make phone calls, negotiate solutions, and coordinate between multiple vendors, work that had historically fallen to me without anyone acknowledging it was work at all. "Your sister is under so much stress," Mom said during one of our increasingly tense conversations. "Planning a wedding is more complicated than anyone realizes." I made sympathetic sounds and changed the subject to my upcoming deployment briefings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Managing logistics for military operations involving hundreds of people and millions of dollars worth of equipment was something I did routinely. But wedding planning was apparently beyond my skill set according to their years of casual dismissal. Meanwhile, my professional life was reaching new heights. The assignment that had come through after the engagement party was everything I'd hoped for: increased command responsibility, a team of exceptional officers, and work that felt meaningful in ways that extended beyond personal satisfaction. My commanding officer had specifically requested me for the position based on my track record of managing complex operations under pressure. The recognition was intoxicating in its simplicity. No hidden agendas, no comparisons to siblings, no qualifications or dismissals. Just straightforward acknowledgement of competence and trust in my ability to deliver results. When Colonel Martinez briefed me on the assignment, his respect was evident in every word, not because he was trying to make me feel better, but because my record had earned it. "You're exactly what this operation needs," he'd said, reviewing my personnel file. "Leadership that can adapt under pressure and maintain team cohesion when stakes are high. Your last 3 assignments show consistent excellence in exactly these conditions." I'd driven home from that meeting feeling lighter than I had in months. Professional validation from people who understood the stakes was worth more than a dozen family dinners where my achievements were politely acknowledged before conversation moved to more interesting topics. The contrast became even sharper when Angelina's wedding crisis escalated. The venue had offered alternative dates that conflicted with Max's work schedule, and the family was scrambling to find solutions that satisfied everyone's requirements. In the past, I would have spent evenings on the phone working through options, researching alternatives, and coordinating between different parties to find workable compromises. Instead, I was preparing for a deployment that would take me overseas for 6 months, focusing on briefings and team preparation that required my full attention. When Dad called to ask if I could maybe help coordinate some of this wedding chaos, I was reviewing intelligence reports and operational parameters for a mission that would affect regional security. "I'm not available for wedding planning," I said simply. "I have work responsibilities that require my focus." But Angelina really needs. Angelina is an adult with a college degree and a successful career. She has parents who love her and in-laws who want to help. She doesn't need me. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusation. I was being selfish, unsisterly, unreasonably stubborn about helping family during a stressful time. But I'd learned to recognize these guilt tactics for what they were: attempts to restore the old dynamic where my time and energy were freely available while my own priorities were considered secondary. "This isn't like you," Dad said finally. "You've always been the one we could count on." "You've always been able to count on me because I made myself available," I corrected. "That doesn't mean it was fair or sustainable, just that I was willing to do it. Now I'm not." The deployment preparation intensified over the following weeks. My team was exceptional: experienced officers who'd worked together before, support staff who understood the mission parameters, and leadership that trusted our competence enough to give us operational autonomy. The respect was mutual and earned, based on demonstrated ability rather than family connections or social charm. During team meetings, my input was valued and my decisions were implemented without question. When I disagreed with proposed strategies, my concerns were heard and addressed seriously. When I recommended personnel changes or resource allocations, they were approved based on my expertise rather than subjected to committee review or second-guessing. The difference from family dynamics was stark enough to be almost comedic. At work, I was General Nolan, whose judgment was trusted on matters of strategic importance. At home, I was the difficult daughter who was being unreasonable about helping with flower arrangements. 2 weeks before my deployment, Angelina's wedding planning reached a crisis point that required immediate attention. The replacement venue had unexpected restrictions on decorations, the catering timeline conflicted with the ceremony schedule, and 3 key vendors had communication breakdowns that threatened to derail multiple aspects of the reception. Mom called me at 7 in the morning, her voice sharp with panic. "We need you," she said without preamble. "This is getting out of hand, and Angelina is having a breakdown. You're the only one who knows how to manage this kind of complicated situation." The admission was everything I'd wanted to hear for years, acknowledgement that my skills had value, that my absence had consequences, that I actually contributed something meaningful to family operations. But it came too late and for the wrong reasons. They needed me now because they were in crisis, not because they valued my contributions as a matter of course. "I'm leaving for deployment in 2 weeks," I said calmly. "My time is committed to mission preparation. This is your sister's wedding. It's important. My work is also important. More important than party planning, actually." The words hung between us like a challenge. For 15 years, they'd treated my military career as less significant than social events and family gatherings. Now they were asking me to prioritize wedding logistics over operational readiness for a deployment that would affect international security. "You're being stubborn," Mom said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone unaccustomed to having requests denied. "This is family. Family works both ways, Mom. You celebrated your only successful child publicly. You made it clear that what I do doesn't matter compared to what Angelina does. Now you want me to drop everything to help with her wedding because suddenly my organizational skills have value. We never said your work doesn't matter. You said Angelina was your only successful child. In front of a room full of people. That's exactly what you said." The conversation ended without resolution, but with a new understanding on both sides. They finally recognized that I'd been providing value they'd taken for granted, and I'd confirmed that their recognition had come too late to change my priorities. My deployment would proceed on schedule. Angelina's wedding would happen with or without my coordination. And for the first time in my adult life, I was entirely comfortable with letting them experience the full consequences of the choices they'd made. The tables had turned completely. They needed me more than I needed their approval, and that shift in power dynamics was permanent. I'd built a life and career that provided satisfaction and recognition without their participation, while they'd discovered that celebrating one daughter often required the uncelebrated contributions of the other. The deployment lasted 6 months and changed everything. Leading a multinational task force through complex operations in 3 different countries, I discovered what it felt like to work with people who valued competence over connections, who measured success by results rather than social approval. My team included officers from 4 different nations, and every one of them treated me with the respect my rank had earned. When I returned home, the landscape had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Angelina's wedding had proceeded on schedule, but not without complications. The stories filtered back to me through casual conversations with family friends, vendor conflicts that had required last-minute solutions, timeline issues that had caused stress on the wedding day, and a generally chaotic experience that could have been smoother with better coordination. "Your sister's wedding was beautiful," Mrs. Jones told me at the grocery store, "but goodness, what a production. Your parents looked exhausted by the end of it." I smiled politely and changed the subject, but the information settled like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. They'd managed without me, but they'd felt my absence in every logistical challenge they'd faced alone. The first contact came from Dad, his voice carrying a different quality than I'd heard before, something that might have been humility. "We'd like to see you," he said during a brief phone call 3 weeks after my return. "When you have time. No pressure about family dinners or anything formal. Just when you're available." The careful phrasing was telling. No assumptions about my schedule, no guilt about missing family events, no expectations that I would automatically make myself available. For the first time in my adult life, they were asking rather than assuming. "I could meet for coffee," I offered. "Saturday afternoon, if you want to drive into town. We'll be there." "Thank you." The meeting took place at a quiet cafe downtown, neutral territory where none of us had emotional history. My parents looked older than I remembered, and there was something different in their bearing, less confidence, more uncertainty about how to navigate the conversation. "You look good," Mom said, studying my face as if searching for signs of anger or resentment. "The deployment suited you." "It went well," I replied simply, not elaborating on the commendations I'd received or the promotion that was being processed. Those details weren't for them anymore, not because I was withholding them, but because they weren't part of my validation process anymore. Dad cleared his throat, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like an anchor. "We wanted to talk about the engagement party," he said slowly. "About what happened. What we said." I waited, letting them choose how much they wanted to acknowledge. "We didn't understand," he continued. "Maybe we still don't. But we were wrong." The words were simple but significant. Not, "you misunderstood," or "it came out wrong," or "everyone knew we didn't mean it that way." Just acknowledgement that they'd been wrong. Mom leaned forward slightly, her expression more serious than I'd seen in years. "We spent so many years not really seeing what you were doing," she said. "Your career, your achievements, we treated them like a hobby instead of recognizing what you'd actually accomplished. That was our failure, not yours." The admission was everything I'd wanted to hear for 15 years, but receiving it now felt different than I'd expected. There was satisfaction in finally being acknowledged, but also a strange sense of distance. The validation I'd craved had come, but I no longer needed it to feel whole. "Angelina's wedding was hard without you," Dad added quietly. "Not just the planning, but we realized how much you'd always done that we never acknowledged. How much we'd taken for granted. And it wasn't fair," Mom continued. "The way we celebrated her and ignored you. The toast at the party was cruel, even if we didn't mean it that way. You deserved better from us." I sipped my coffee and considered how to respond. The conversation felt surreal after months of operating in environments where my competence was assumed and my leadership was valued without question. Coming back to family dynamics required a mental shift I wasn't entirely prepared for. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "But I need you to understand that this isn't something that can be fixed with an apology. This was 15 years of choices. Every time you changed the subject when I talked about work, every time you dismissed my achievements, every time you made it clear that my career didn't matter compared to Angelina's social life. The engagement party just made it public." They nodded, and I could see they were processing the scope of what they were acknowledging. This wasn't about one evening or one poorly chosen toast. It was about years of systematic dismissal that had shaped our entire relationship. "What do we do now?" Mom asked. "How do we fix this?" "I don't know if you can," I said honestly. "I've built a life that doesn't require your approval anymore. I have work that matters, colleagues who respect me, and a sense of purpose that comes from what I do rather than what you think about what I do. That's not going to change." The words weren't cruel, but they were definitive. I wasn't negotiating for better treatment or setting conditions for reconciliation. I was simply stating the reality of where things stood. "But we'd like to try," Dad said. "If you're willing. We'd like to understand what we missed, what your work actually involves, what you've accomplished that we never bothered to learn about." The offer was tentative but genuine. They weren't demanding immediate forgiveness or expecting things to return to normal. They were asking for the opportunity to build something different, based on actual knowledge of who I was rather than assumptions about who they wanted me to be. "That would take time," I said. "And it would mean actually listening when I talk about my work, not waiting for the conversation to move to something more interesting." "We understand." The meeting ended without dramatic reconciliation or emotional breakthroughs. Instead, we made tentative plans for another conversation the following month, dinner at a restaurant where we could talk without the weight of family history pressing down on every interaction. As I drove home, I realized something had shifted permanently. The desperate need for their approval that had driven me for decades was gone, replaced by something calmer and more sustainable. They could choose to understand and respect my life, or they could continue dismissing it, but either way, I would be fine. For the first time in my adult life, I was negotiating from a position of strength rather than need. The change felt as liberating as my first deployment, but far more permanent. 6 months have passed since that first careful conversation at the downtown cafe, and the family dynamic has settled into something entirely different from what any of us expected. There's no dramatic healing, no tearful reconciliation scene where years of hurt dissolve into understanding. Instead, there's a cautious respect that feels more sustainable than the forced closeness we used to maintain. My parents ask about my work now, and they listen to the answers. When I mentioned the task force I led during my last deployment, Dad took notes on a napkin, asking questions about operational structure and international cooperation. When I received a commendation for innovation in logistical management, Mom asked to see the actual citation rather than just nodding politely and changing the subject. The effort is visible and sometimes awkward, like watching someone learn a new language in middle age. They're trying to understand a world they've ignored for 15 years, and the learning curve is steep. But they're trying, which is more than I expected and enough to build on. Angelina's adjustment has been more complex. The wedding went well despite the coordination challenges, and she's settled into married life with characteristic adaptability. But something fundamental shifted when she realized that being the favorite child came with expectations she'd never had to meet before. Without me to handle the logistics of family life, more responsibility has fallen to her, and she's discovering that natural charm doesn't always translate to practical competence. "I never realized how much you did," she admitted during a recent phone conversation. "All those family events, the coordination, making sure everything ran smoothly, I thought it just happened naturally." The acknowledgement wasn't quite an apology, but it was recognition. She's beginning to understand that our family functioned as well as it did not because of her social skills, but because of infrastructure she'd never noticed. The revelation has made her less confident about her role as the golden child and more aware of what maintaining family relationships actually requires. My career continues to advance, but the trajectory feels different now that I'm not constantly translating achievements into terms my family might appreciate. The promotion I received 3 months ago was satisfying purely on its own merits: recognition from colleagues, increased responsibility, and work that challenges me in ways that feel meaningful. I shared the news with my parents, and they responded with genuine pride rather than polite acknowledgement. "General Nolan," Dad said when I called to tell them about the new assignment. "We're proud of you. Really proud." The words carried weight they'd never had before because they came from a place of understanding rather than obligation. He'd spent time learning what my rank actually meant, what kinds of responsibilities came with it, and what the promotion represented in terms of professional recognition. His pride was informed rather than reflexive. The boundaries I established after the engagement party remain in place, but they've evolved from protective walls into practical parameters. I attend some family events now, but on my own terms. When Angelina's anniversary dinner conflicted with a work commitment, I chose work without guilt or lengthy explanations. When Mom's birthday celebration fell during a training exercise I was leading, I arranged to celebrate with her the following weekend instead of rearranging military schedules to accommodate social expectations. The difference is that these choices are respected now rather than challenged. My parents understand that my professional responsibilities take precedence over family social events, and they plan accordingly rather than assuming I'll rearrange my schedule to fit theirs. Last month, I brought a colleague to Dad's retirement party, Colonel Angelina Chin, who'd worked with me on the International Task Force. Watching my parents interact with her was illuminating. They treated her with the kind of respect they'd learned to show me, asking intelligent questions about her work and listening carefully to her responses. But more than that, I could see them understanding, perhaps for the first time, what my professional relationships were like: the mutual regard, the shared competence, the easy communication between people who understood each other's work. "Your colleague is impressive," Mom said later. "And it's clear she respects you enormously. The way she talked about your leadership, we never understood that side of who you are." The observation was accurate and telling. They were finally seeing me through the eyes of people who knew my professional capabilities rather than filtering everything through their preconceptions about what my life should look like. The engagement party feels like ancient history now, but its impact was permanent and ultimately positive. That moment when my parents raised their glasses to toast their only successful child stripped away years of careful pretense and forced everyone to confront the actual dynamics we'd been living with. Colonel Ashford's salute didn't just correct a social error, it revealed a truth that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Looking back, I realized the betrayal wasn't in the words themselves, but in the years of choices that led up to them. Every conversation where my achievements were minimized, every family gathering where my career was treated as less important than social events, every assumption that my time and energy were freely available without acknowledgement. All of that culminated in that toast. But the revelation worked both ways. While they were publicly dismissing my success, I was privately building a life that didn't require their validation. The military had given me everything I'd been seeking from my family: clear standards, earned respect, advancement based on merit, and colleagues who valued my contributions. I'd been looking for approval in the wrong place for 15 years. The family relationships we're building now are more honest and more sustainable than what we had before. My parents can't pretend anymore that they don't understand what I do or that it doesn't matter. I can't pretend anymore that their approval is necessary for my sense of worth. Angelina can't pretend that being naturally gifted at social situations translates to being naturally gifted at everything else. These recognitions have created space for actual relationships rather than the performance we use to maintain. When we spend time together now, it's because we choose to, not because obligation demands it. When they express pride in my achievements, it means something because it's informed and genuine. When I help with family logistics, it's appreciated rather than assumed. I still think about that moment sometimes: the crowded room, my parents' confident toast, the laughter that followed, and then Colonel Ashford rising to his feet. The silence that fell when he saluted me, the shift in atmosphere, my sister's shocked expression, my parents' frozen smiles. It was the moment everything changed, not just for them but for me. That salute didn't just correct a social error, it showed me what respect looked like when it was real. And once I'd seen it, once I'd felt what it was like to be valued by people who understood what I'd accomplished, there was no going back to seeking approval from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth celebrating. The lesson endures. Respect isn't begged for, it's lived, earned, and sometimes demanded by the simple act of refusing to accept anything less. Whether my family fully reconciles or not, I've learned to find my worth in places where it's recognized and valued. That clarity is worth more than any toast, any celebration, any recognition they could have offered years too late. The room fell silent that night, but the silence was just the beginning. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing intelligence briefings for an upcoming NATO exercise. Mom's voice was different, smaller somehow, with an undertone I'd never heard before. "Your father's in the hospital," she said without preamble. "Heart attack. They're saying it was minor, but—" Her voice trailed off, and I could hear the fear she was trying to contain. I was in my car within 20 minutes, driving toward the same hospital where I'd been born, where Angelina had broken her arm falling off her bike, where we'd visited grandparents in their final days. The familiar route felt different now, not like coming home, but like returning to a place I'd once belonged. The cardiac unit was quiet, all hushed conversations and soft-soled shoes on polished floors. I found Mom in the waiting room, smaller than I remembered, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She looked up when I entered, relief flooding her features. "He's stable," she said immediately. "The doctor says the damage was minimal, but they want to keep him for observation. He's sleeping now." I sat beside her, and we waited in the particular silence that hospitals create, not peaceful, but suspended, as if normal life has been temporarily paused while more important things sort themselves out. "Angelina's flying in from her honeymoon," Mom continued. "She'll be here tonight. Max wanted to come too, but I told her it wasn't necessary." "Not yet." The qualifier hung between us. "Not yet, but if things got worse, then yes, the whole family would gather." The old patterns would reassert themselves in the face of genuine crisis, because that's what families do when the stakes become real. A nurse emerged from Dad's room and approached us with professional kindness. "He's awake now, if you'd like to see him. Just family, and only 2 at a time." Mom looked at me expectantly, and I realized this was another test of the new dynamic we'd been building. In the old days, she would have gone in first, then summoned me when it was convenient. Now she was asking, offering me equal consideration. "You go first," I said. "I'll wait here." She squeezed my hand before rising, a gesture that carried more weight than usual. I watched her walk toward Dad's room, her shoulders straight but her step uncertain, and realized how much they'd both aged in the months since we'd begun rebuilding our relationship. 20 minutes later, she returned with eyes slightly red but composed. "He wants to see you now. He's worried about something." The coronary care unit had that particular hospital smell of disinfectant and recycled air, but Dad looked better than I'd expected. Pale but alert, hooked up to monitors that beeped reassuringly, his eyes clear when he turned toward me. "There's my general," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Took a heart attack to get you to visit me in a hospital gown." "Your timing has always been dramatic," I replied, settling into the chair beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been reminded I'm not 25 anymore." He shifted slightly, wincing. "But that's not what I wanted to talk about. The doctor says this was a warning. My cholesterol's too high. I need to change my diet, exercise more." Standard lecture for overweight men in their 60s. I nodded, waiting for whatever was really on his mind. But lying here, thinking about what could have happened. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I kept thinking about that night at the engagement party. About what I said, what we said. About how we could have lost you years ago, and instead of celebrating everything you'd accomplished, we spent 15 years making you feel like it didn't matter. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but something in the room had shifted. "Dad, let me finish," he said quietly. "I need to say this while I have the chance. We were wrong. Not just about the toast, not just about that one night, but about everything. For years. We were so proud of Angelina's conventional success that we missed the extraordinary thing you were doing. We missed who you'd become." He reached for the water cup on his bedside table, his movements careful and deliberate. "Your mother and I talked about this during those awful months when you wouldn't come to family dinners. We talked about what we'd lost, what we'd thrown away because we were too stubborn or too blind to see it. And then when you started giving us another chance, when you began teaching us about your work, your life." He shook his head. "We realized we'd wasted 15 years being proud of the wrong things." The words settled between us like stones dropping into still water. I'd imagined conversations like this during the early months after the engagement party, fantasized about the apologies that would make everything right. But hearing them now, in this sterile room with machines monitoring his heartbeat, they felt different than I'd expected. "I'm proud of you," he continued. "Not just your rank, not just your achievements, but who you are. The kind of person who serves something bigger than herself, who leads people through impossible situations, who carries responsibility that most of us can't even imagine." I should have said that years ago. I should have said it every time I had the chance. I felt something shift inside my chest, not the dramatic release I'd once imagined, but something quieter and more sustainable. The validation I'd craved for so long was finally being offered freely, without conditions or qualifications. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means more than you know." "I also need to ask you something," he said, his voice growing more serious. "If something happens to me, not today, the doctors say this was minor, but when my time comes, I need to know you'll help your mother and Angelina. Not because you owe us anything, but because you're the strongest person in this family. Because you know how to handle things when they get complicated." The request was everything the old dynamic had been built on, the assumption that I would step in during crises, manage difficult situations, provide stability when others couldn't. But coming from him now, after everything we'd acknowledged and worked to change, it felt different. "Of course," I said. "But not the way it used to be. Not as the invisible support system who keeps everything running while someone else gets the credit. As your daughter, as their sister, as someone whose contribution is recognized and valued." He nodded emphatically. "Yes, exactly that. As the leader you've always been, finally getting the recognition you deserve." We sat quietly for a few minutes, listening to the monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity. The conversation felt complete, but also like a beginning, not just of his recovery, but of something we'd never quite had before. "Your mother's going to want to stay here tonight," he said eventually. "And Angelina will want to make a production of Flying in Early, probably with flowers and dramatic concern. That's who she is, and that's okay. But I wanted to talk to you first, while it was just us." "I'm glad you did." A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking his chart and adjusting medication levels. The routine medical care that would carry him through the next few days, the practical management of recovery that required expertise and attention to detail. "I should let you rest," I said, standing to leave. "But I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll stay as long as you need me to." "I know you will," he said, his eyes already showing the fatigue that comes with medical crisis and emotional breakthrough. "You've always been dependable." We just forgot to appreciate what that meant. I left the hospital as evening was settling over the city, the familiar landscape looking different somehow, not like home, exactly, but like a place where I belonged in ways I was still learning to understand. The family relationships we were building would be tested by this crisis, but they felt strong enough now to handle the pressure. For the first time in years, I was driving toward family obligation not with resentment or resignation, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose help was genuinely wanted and would be properly valued. It had taken a heart attack to complete what the engagement party had started, but the transformation was finally real. The road ahead was clear, and I was exactly where I needed to be. That's where I drew the line, and I haven't looked back. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Your turn. Have you dealt with family favoritism or a public putdown? What boundary did you set, and how did people react? If you were at that engagement party, what would you have done in my place? What's one piece of advice you'd give someone facing the golden child dynamic? Drop your story in the comments. I read every one.